Last week I started too soon before we started the recording, so some choice words got lost in this. Just a little remembrance of the chronology. Skipping the Christmas and Epiphany moments in the scripture and beginning with the baptism of Jesus, the public ministry starts there at the baptism of Jesus. Immediately following his baptism, there's the proclamation and announcement that the reign of God is at hand. Jesus goes in Luke's gospel anyway, Jesus goes into the synagogue, and there in the synagogue opens the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and proclaims that it is the time of Jubilee, that the blind will see, the lame will walk, the deaf will hear, good news will be preached to the oppressed, people will be set free and lifted up. At that point, there's no evidence at all that any of that is going to happen. But as the gospel unfolds, sure enough, evidence begins to appear. If you follow Mark's gospel, the first miracle is that Jesus goes into the synagogue in Capernaum and heals a leper, heals a man possessed, heals Peter's mother-in-law. So that already evidence that the reign of God is in the midst of the people begins to appear. But as the gospel goes to the next stage, and that's where we are today, is that there is no thought at all that this is going to be totally on the shoulders of Jesus, that it's going to require disciples. It will require individuals that will also share in the work, not only of proclaiming and announcing the good news of the reign of God, but also being instruments of the very things that Jesus is doing. That they too will be healers. They too will be instruments of setting free people. Remember how Corinthians said it? There are varieties of gifts within the community, and each one has a gift that contributes to the well-being and the thriving and prospering of the community. And that comes from this idea that everyone now is an agent, an instrument, a partner with Jesus in announcing that the reign of God is at hand. It will also mean, as we will discover soon enough, that it means that it has to be something in the disciples' own life. Not that it means a conversion or a coming to Jesus moment in their life, although that might happen. But it means that there has to be a match between the words that you believe or think in your head with the actions of your life, that will appear soon enough. So here we come to this story in the gospel today. And this story is an interesting one. In Mark and Matthew, the call of disciples happens immediately after that proclamation. But here in Luke, there's this very interesting story that gives us an insight, perhaps, into who these people are that are the first disciples of Jesus. They're fisher people out at the Lake of Gennesaret, or today the Lake of Galilee. I'm sure that as we come upon this scene, you see that these individuals have been hard at it all day, that they're now dejected, if you will, another day without food on our table, without fish to sell in the marketplace, with nothing but nets that have to be mended. Jesus comes on the scene and almost in a presumptuous way says, gets into one of the boats, Simon's boat, without even asking Simon if it was okay for him to do so, and tells Simon, almost demands that Simon push out into the shore, out from the shore, so that Jesus could speak to his adoring fans who have gathered there along the Lake of Galilee. It's just kind of a strange scene, if you will. Hardworking individuals who are tasked with providing for their family and enough fish to sell in the marketplace are now being forced to do something different, doing something out of the norm than what they're used to doing. That's going to be a hint of what's going to be expected in their future. Jesus begins to teach, and we're not quite told what he teaches yet, but he begins to speak to the crowds. In any event, after he gets through preaching, he again places a demand, push out, cast your nets out. And it's interesting because the response that Simon gives is, what are you talking about? We've been hard at it all night and there are no fish. And what you have to understand is the Lake of Galilee is not a super huge lake. Some translations say the Sea of Galilee, so you think about almost an ocean. Well, the Lake of Galilee, you can see across it. You can see from top to bottom of it. So it's not a very big lake. It's a very deep lake. It sits in the Great Rift Valley that starts in Syria and actually goes all the way down into Central Africa. So at the point of where we're at, we're almost at about 700 feet below sea level at the Lake of Galilee. And the Lake of Galilee is about another 500 feet deeper than that. So you sit in this bowl, if you will, of the Great Rift Valley that fills from the Jordan River that flows out of the mountains in Lebanon, that will eventually flow out of the Lake of Galilee and attempts to make it to the Dead Sea down further in Palestine. In any event, it is by the way, it's a freshwater lake on top of it, unlike the Dead Sea, all right? That's saltiest body of water except for the Great Salt Lake in Utah. So as a freshwater lake, it teems with fish. But the problem is, because it's such a big lake, meaning deep lake, the fish aren't always readily available. And so the odds are that when you go out to fish, there are probably going to be more days that you don't catch anything than when you catch something. And on top of it, what you catch is not always going to be very much. And so when they cast their nets out and they get a huge amount of fish, such that the one boat can't hold it all, and so they have to come and gather it in, and even then. Now you have to think for a moment. Excuse me. How would you respond to a situation like that? Where you've worked hard at something, you've tried things, you've done everything you can, and along comes this crazy guy from Nazareth and demands that you do something that is counterintuitive. We've been hard at it all night, and why do you think it's going to be any different? And yet, when they do what he tells them to do, they're absolutely, and you hear it in the text, they're all amazed. The astonishment at how this has all happened just overwhelms them, if you will. Now keep that idea in mind. In any event, Simon Peter, and this is a part of the text that is interesting, right? Simon admits that he's not worthy to be in the presence, whether it's of Jesus himself, or he's not worthy to embrace or accept what has just happened. You know, I'm just a poor fisher person. I can't handle this because it's pushing me, and see, here's the direction that it's taken. It's pushing me to think in a way that I'm not used to thinking, and responding in a way that I'm not used to responding. Probably when they caught something, they were not astonished at what they caught. It was just expected. Oh, you throw nets out into the lake, you're going to get something. They were more dejected at that point than astonished. And yet, when they do get this huge amount of fish, they are astonished and amazed. Now, I want to suggest, stepping out of the story moment, I want to suggest that this is how the reign of God works. That the reign of God takes you by surprise at times. Takes you or makes you unsettled, if you will, because it pushes you to think out of your normal way of thinking into a new way of seeing reality. And in the way that it pushes you to do that, remember the story I told you about the first time that I preached in my home parish? And my mom's response to my preaching was, gee, I didn't think you had it in you. That she was absolutely surprised. Why? Because I probably had never given her any evidence at all that I was able to get up in front of people and speak. I was an introvert, believe it or not. I'm more of an introvert than an extrovert. And so it took her off guard. It surprised her. Think of all those times in your life where you've been caught off guard and surprised for the good. One of your children where you just can't imagine that they're necessarily going to, well, let me say it this way in terms of me, that they just can't imagine that they will amount to much of anything because there's no evidence at all that they've given to you at that point. And then they do something like, oh my God, there really is something going on good there. Wow. I want to suggest that that's the reign of God. That's the inbreaking of the reign of God, where what you normally think, how you normally respond, how you usually act, pushes you off kilter, pushes you out of your old way of thinking. And that's what Simon's doing. He's got an old way of thinking at that point. I'm not worthy to stand in this amazed place in the reign of God. And Jesus says, remember what was said on the baptism? That the voice from heaven comes to Jesus and says, you're my beloved. Simon hadn't gotten that message yet, that he's God's beloved. Maybe nobody in his life ever told him that he was the beloved of God. I share this with the nurses that I teach. Some of them have been nurses in prisons. And I can sense fear in them, that they have to care without any distinction, care for people who may have been murderers, child abusers. And they tell me back, and I affirm it and expand on it. They say, we know that as a nurse, we have to treat them in the same way that we would treat anybody else. And I tell them this, I said, the minute you say something good to them, may have been the first time in their life that anybody ever said anything good to them. Right? Somebody who's been put down, shoved down, told they're good for nothing, told that they will never amount to anything, that the first time somebody says something to them that recognizes that they are made in the imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God, and that they are the beloved of God, probably astonishes them. Because they have no evidence that they have ever been good. It's like the self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways, right? And the nurse says to them, you're in the image of God. That could potentially change their life forever. That's how the reign of God works. Potentially, the reign of God can enter into our midst in a way that changes everything about how we perceive the world, how we relate to other people, the kinds of choices and decisions that we're going to make each and every day. That's how the reign of God works. But here's the catch. It's never about God acting on us. Because the biblical tradition always works this way. Remember how Genesis starts? God said, let there be light, and there was light. God said, let there be, and there was. So that in the biblical tradition, that whenever God speaks or acts, there's always an expected response. I experienced this the first time when I went to an African-American church. And being a white guy, growing up in a German-Irish community where you went to church and you never said anything in church, right? And when Vatican II came along and we were now going to respond to the prayers of the priest, people look around and go, we can speak in church, you mean? You know how that first time ever happened? And so there we are in a situation where I grew up not thinking I could speak. And the preacher was saying, and somebody yells out in the congregation, "Amen!" And I immediately turned around like, what? You know, the first time that I preached with African American community and got responses back. That's in the African American tradition. It's call and response. You did it out in the field because when you're out in the field, you want to make sure that you can keep contact with the other people in the field because somebody might die. Somebody might run away. Somebody might seek their freedom by being out in the field and running out into and you need to know that in some way. And so you always do the call and response. So that's the biblical tradition. That when God speaks, it's not that everybody stops like the old E.F. Hutton commercials where everybody stops in silence. When God speaks, there's a response that is expected. So that when this experience at the lake happens, and they're all amazed and astonished, that we could stop right there. And everybody would go back to their homes, and the fisher people would go off saying, wow, to their wives, wow, look what we got. We got fish for the next 10 weeks. Wow, we're going to be able to buy new clothes because we got more fish than we know what to do with this sell in the market. And everybody goes about their way as if, wow, that was an interesting experience. No. Within the biblical tradition, that a response is expected to that moment of astonishment. A response is expected when you recognize that the reign of God has broken into your humdrum, normal, regular way of life, that a response is expected that pushes you now to a new, not just way of thinking, but a new way of being in the world. Because you can't be the same. Think of how many times and instances in which biblical people have name changes after this. You're going to know, right? Simon is not going to be called Simon, he's going to be called Peter. Saul, the persecutor, becomes Paul. That a name change signifies the new responsibilities and obligations that once you have encountered the reign of God, you're not the same anymore. And so the ending of the story says, Jesus said, come follow me. And they leave everything immediately and follow him. Now, I don't think it's quite that simple. But in any event, you see, it has to be, and I'll say it this way, it has to be an immediate response. That's difficult because we usually want to say, well, what is it going to cost me? What am I going to have to do? You know, it's like signing, we refinanced our house this year. And so when you get to the point of signing that document, you know, they always say, you know, make sure that you read all the fine print. Who the heck ever reads all the fine print? Right? It's 20 pages long. Who's going to read? Jim probably has. He's read all the fine print. Who does that? Because then they always ask you to check that box at the end, right? Have you read all of what you're signing on to? I bet all of us do it, right? We just check it because we got to get to the next screen. And then along somewhere down the road, somebody says, but didn't you read the fine print? You go, why? Why would I do that? Well, because now you know what the responsibility and obligation is, because now you're in violation. Oh, well, then I want to blame, usually in our American way now is to blame somebody else for the fact that we didn't read the fine print. Well, it was our responsibility to do so. In any event, I'm off track a little bit. But the point is that when they follow Jesus at that moment, they become disciples. And the disciple is not one who just follows for the sake of following, or just follows because it's great to be in the limelight with Jesus. Because Jesus gets invited to all the big parties like at Cana. And boy, isn't it great to be in the company of someone who's going to get all the finer things. And so that you could begin to think that following somebody like that gives you a great deal of privilege. I must have 40 people that I follow on Facebook. Do I ever read everything that they send out? No. But I still follow them in a sense, because one day there might be something nice. But following here isn't like that. Following here has to do with discipleship. And discipleship means, again, if you think of how I frame this, that when you've encountered the reign of God, and when you've been transformed and changed in astonishment at how God is working there, and you want to respond to it, then it means that you do take on a new way of being in the world. That discipleship puts you in a position where now you are not free to do whatever you want to do. You're not free to think whatever you want to think. You're not free to do nothing. Discipleship carries with it obligations and responsibilities to first and foremost not think of yourself first, but to always think of others first. That's what the golden rule says, right? Do to others first what you want them to do to you second. So if this is about, as we heard in the synagogue last week, that the Jubilee has been announced, that the poor will have good news proclaimed to them, that prisoners will be set free, that the downtrodden, the blind, the lame, the deaf will hear and see and walk, that if that's what the reign of God is about, then you see discipleship means that we've got to be doing those things with reference to others. So that means that if, and this is the worldview that I've talked about several times, just a few more thoughts about it. That if in our worldview before we thought God was an angry, punishing, judging, condemning God, that when we experience the compassion and love of God in God's way, that we can no longer think that way. We now have to think that God is always compassionate. How Exodus says it, God is slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in love, abounding in kindness. That if that's who we come to experience God to be, then that's how we have to live our lives. Even if it does mean sometimes calling out people who say something other than. God isn't judging and condemning and hateful. The rhetoric of our time wants to say that rhetoric of hate and anger and retribution is more the norm than the talk of compassion and forgiveness and healing. You see how that sounds, the difference? So that it also tells us that if God is creator and that everything that exists is of God, being the disciple means we can't continue to abuse and misuse the resources that God has given us. That we can't think that they're there for our use and we can use it as much as we want. We can use it all up if we want. that it doesn't matter how we harm the earth, how we injure the animals. It does matter. Because the way that we care for God's creation is an expression, an example of how everyone is invited to live with reference to creation. It means, and this is the harder one today, it means that if we are the beloved, then everyone is the beloved. Even terrorists are the beloved. Every person who shows up at our border is the beloved. And therefore, the response that we make cannot be one that denigrates, that degrades, that demeans, and diminishes anyone who is the beloved of God. That's what it means. That's the bottom line. That's the norm for disciples. That's what it means to be in the reign of God. You see that we are the ones. Jesus changes the world of all those people he encounters. Well, he's not here except in us. And since Jesus is in us, then you see the transformation and change in the world depends upon us as disciples to do so. That's our vision. That's our way of life. And in that, I guarantee, in that will come much astonishment. Try it sometime. Honor someone's dignity, and you'll be astonished. I remember the first time, I think, in the midst of all the pandemic, of saying to someone at the checkout counter at the grocery store, "Thank you for the work you do." And they stopped and they were like, it was almost like nobody had ever said that to them. And a smile came on their face. Even you could see it under their mask. Isn't that amazing? When you just do that, the change that happens. We're all called to be disciples, not just members of the disciples of Christ. We're all called first and foremost disciples, to be disciples of Jesus in the reign of God.